Well, welcome everyone to the Miller Center. I'm Bill Antholis. I'm the new director at the Miller Center. I've been here all of 4 days, and it's a real delight, but I've been here in Charlottesville a lot longer than that. I was an undergrad at the university and have lived here for the last 15 years and have been a regular attendee at various Miller Center events. More importantly, I've gotten to know the community and the community of scholars, which is probably the first and foremost reason why I was so excited to apply for and get chosen to be the director here. This is a wonderful place, and as I've gotten to know an even wider set of the scholars and the staff and the members of the Broad Miller Center family, I just can't tell you how excited I am about the years ahead. But enough about me and about you, about our special guest. First, thanks to a few people in making this event. Will Hitchcock, who runs the academic affairs dimensions of the Miller Center and who has pulled together this historical presidency series more broadly. Last year, under Gary Gallagher's expert guidance, we focused on the 19th century. And this year, thanks to Mel Leffler, who will be introducing our special guest and moderating the conversation, who is the Edward Stettinius professor in the history department, we'll be focusing on the 20th century presidency, taking us from Woodrow Wilson through Herbert Hoover and FDR and LBJ all the way to Ronald Reagan at least. So with that, thank you all very much for welcoming me, and I hand it over to Mel.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to see all of you here. January, is a time of new beginnings. So we make resolutions. We professors resolve that we're going to do a better job this term than we did last term. And this year there's a new beginning because we have a new director here of the Miller Center, Bill Antholis, and I know we're all feeling incredibly fortunate to have somebody with his experience, ambition, and vision. So we're all very much looking forward to work with him. And it's a new beginning as well, as Bill just said, because we're starting a new presidential history lecture series. And Gary Gallagher ran a terrifically successful one. Many of you came to some of the lectures last year on the 19th century. And as Bill Antholis just said, we've put together a group of terrific people to come and talk about 20th century presidential leadership in times of crisis. So we're going to have George Nash come in a few weeks, or I should say really on March 3rd, and he's going to talk about Herbert Hoover's dealings with the Great Depression. Mark Stoller is going to talk. He's one of the great military historians of the 20th century. He's going to come and talk about Roosevelt's dealings with World War II. David Kennedy is going to talk about Franklin Roosevelt and the Great Depression. David Kennedy, as you know, it's a Pulitzer Prize winner. That's going to be followed with Fred Logevall talking about LBJ and the agony of the Vietnam War. Fred Logevall also just won the Pulitzer Prize last year for his book called Embers of War on Vietnam. And then Tom Blanton's going to finish the series next December. This is going to go over the calendar year. And Tom Blanton is the head of the National Security Archive. And he's going to talk about Ronald Reagan and the end of the Cold War. But today we're going to begin the whole series where it should begin in terms of the 20th century, on Woodrow Wilson in War and Peace. And as many of you know, I think all of you know who are here, we are commemorating this year the 100th anniversary of the onset of World War I, 1914, 2014, 2015. And of course, here in the United States, the Great War is indelibly linked to the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. Wilson's presidency was infused with irony and contradiction. Many of you may know that when he assumed office in 1913, his primary focus was intentionally going to be on domestic priorities. But he wound up spending most of the next 8 years dealing with one foreign crisis after another, and most particularly World War I. When World War I erupted, Wilson wanted to stay aloof, keep the United States neutral. But he wound up embarking on a great crusade abroad to make the world safe for democracy. Wilson was the first president during his tenure in office to actually go abroad. He went to Paris at the end of 1918 to engage in the negotiations at the Paris Peace Conference. When he went abroad, he was heralded as a great savior in December of 1918. The crowds in Paris and London and Rome, all the great cities of Europe that he visited right before the peace conference, people came out in the hundreds of thousands to greet Wilson. He was a real hero. By the time he wound up leaving Paris in June of 1919 permanently, he was being scorned and ridiculed. And personally, he couldn't wait to leave. And when he returned home, the League and the treaty seemed to have the majority support of the American people, at least judged by newspaper editorials and magazine editorials. But his foes in the US Senate assailed Wilson's handiwork, the Treaty of Versailles, and particularly the League of Nations, and they impelled him to go on a nationwide tour to drum up support for the League of Nations and the treaty, during which, of course, he was stricken with a terrible stroke and then incapacitated for the rest of his presidency. Now, even in his personal life, Wilson was a very contradictory figure. To many, and if you see pictures of him, you think of him as a very prudish and austere person. But privately, Wilson was charming and witty and very passionate. He was grief-stricken when his first wife died in 1914. But very quickly, he struck up a romantic relationship with a Washington socialite named Edith Bowling. And the joke around Washington went like this, quote, "What did the new Mrs. Wilson do when the president proposed?" The answer, "She fell out of bed with surprise." So I lifted that anecdote actually from Margaret Macmillan's wonderful book on peacemaking in 1919. And we are incredibly lucky to have Margaret Macmillan here with us today. She is truly one of the outstanding, one of the most distinguished historians of international relations in the world. She's a professor of history at Oxford and the warden, the head of St. Anthony's College at Oxford. For those of you who have been at Oxford, I was privileged enough to spend a year there about a decade ago. You know that St. Anthony's is one of perhaps arguably the best place in the world to study international relations. Professor Macmillan has written many books. She's written on British women in India, on Nixon's opening of relations with China. She's written on the uses and abuses of history, but most of all, she's known for her two wonderful volumes on World War I. The first that she wrote about a dozen years ago was on peacemaking in 1919. And the other, which just appeared last year, is about the origins of World War I, the war that ended peace. That's the name of the book. And the former book, the one that in some ways will be the framework for today's lecture, I suspect, won, I'd say, a half dozen of the English-speaking world's most prestigious prizes for the best book on international relations. So I'm incredibly happy to have Margaret McMillan here with us. She's going to talk for 40 or 45 minutes about Wilson in War and Peace. Then I will engage her in a conversation for 10 or 15 minutes, and then I'll open it up for questions. Thank you.
I'd like to thank you very much for that kind introduction. I should warn you about that joke about Mrs. Wilson. The man who made it was asked to leave Washington. So. And I'd like to thank the Miller Center for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here, and a great pleasure to be, I'm ashamed to say, my first visit to the University of Virginia and to Charlottesville. And aren't you lucky to live in such a wonderful place? Anyway, I'm going to talk today about Woodrow Wilson in War and Peace. As you probably know, in 1913, just at the beginning of his first administration, he said to a friend, "It would be an irony of fate if my administration had to focus on foreign policy." It was not his interest. It was not something that he particularly wanted to have to do. And as Professor Loeffler said, that was something that he ended up doing. And I think we look at him because he presides over the United States at a time of great crisis in world history. The Great War, the First World War, as it later on came to be called, was one of the great crises of modern history. It shattered much of the old European order. It had consequences which lasted for decades, perhaps into the 21st century, and it affected much of the rest of the world as well. But it's also a very important moment in American history as well as in world history, because it's a time when the United States is in the process of transforming its already great economic strength, its great strength as a nation which is finally coming together after the scars and trauma of the Civil War, when the United States begins transforming that strength into military strength. I mean, when the war began, the United States was not a military power in any sense of the word. It had a small navy, although it was beginning to build up its naval strength. It had a very small army. It counted in military terms much less than a much smaller country such as Italy. And what we see as a consequence of the First World War is the beginnings of the United States becoming a truly global power. I mean, those beginnings were there before 1914, but the period between 1914 and 1918 is, as I say, both a very important period in the history of the United States and a very important period in the history of the world. And so it is important, I think, to look both at what was happening in the world, what was happening in the United States, and at the personality of Woodrow Wilson himself. Because as president, he not only expressed the feelings and aspirations of a great many Americans, he came to power on that great surge of progressive sentiment, sentiment that was hoping to remake American society. But he also came to express something of American views of themselves and what they might be doing in the world. And so I do think we have to pay attention to Wilson the man, but we have to put him very firmly in the context of his times. His personality and his character and his many foibles would not have mattered if it were not that he was in charge of an important nation, an increasingly important nation, at a pivotal time in history. Melvin has said something about the personality of that man, and I think he remains a puzzle to a lot of us, historians and others, and will continue to remain a puzzle because, like a lot of human beings, he's very contradictory. He was a great idealist, and he was also someone who would act in an absolutely ruthless way. If you crossed him, he tended to assume that you were his enemy. He was not good at accepting that people could have different points of view from him. His life is marked by a series of rejecting those who have contradicted him, stood against him, disagreed with him. He could be extraordinarily rigid. He was a great orator, perhaps one of the greatest orators among American presidents, but he also, in private, told some of the worst jokes I've ever seen. When he was in Paris, he was surrounded by a group of course, people who were working for him and admiring him, and they used to write down his conversations in the evening. And they wrote down his jokes. And if you ever want to go, there's a huge collection of his papers. But if you ever want to find some really bad shaggy dog stories, I would go to the Wilson papers. These are jokes, I don't know how they stood them. The sort of jokes that go on for 20 minutes with an Irishman, a Scotsman, a Southerner, a Northerner. You all know that sort of joke. I won't bother to tell them. He was an intellectual in office, but he was also a very good practical politician. And anyone who'd been governor of New Jersey knew something about the practicalities of politics, and he'd been, in fact, a very effective governor. He was someone who liked engaging with ideas, liked discussing ideas, but he could also be very rigid once he'd made his mind up. Those who knew him well said that he would talk about policy until he'd made up his mind, and then there'd be no further discussion. He also had a confidence, and who knows where it came from, that he understood better than many other elected leaders what the people wanted. The people, he said, and he never really defined what the people was, but it seemed to be those who agreed with him, the people spoke through him. And this is where he ran into trouble in Europe, because he said to the elected leaders of France, of Britain, of Italy, your people have spoken to me, I know what they want, I know what the people of the world want. The French ambassador in Washington, who observed him closely and I think quite liked him, said of him that he was a man who, had he lived a couple of centuries ago, would have been the greatest tyrant in the world, because he does not seem to have the slightest conception that he can ever be wrong. And I think this is something that marks Wilson. I mean, a very intelligent man, a very interesting man, but a man who could also be immovable and rigid. Now, when he came to office, he had, like of course many Americans, very strong sense of what the United States could do in the world. And I think part of his understanding and his views of what the United States could do in the world came from his own background. He was a devout Presbyterian. He remained a believer all his life. And I think he believed in the role of good works, that it was the responsibility of people put on earth to carry out good works. And he believed that the United States had a role and indeed an obligation to do good works in the world. He believed that the United States could and should be a force for good. The United States should be an example to the world. As he said when he was campaigning in New Jersey in 1912, America is an idea, America is an ideal, America is a vision. And that, I think, is something that helps to shape his attitude towards American neighbors, to those that he has to deal with, and towards America's enemies. He supported the Spanish-American War, although he'd initially opposed it, but he convinced himself that the United States was actually bringing the benefits of civilization to the territories which it took over from the Spanish. He supported the intervention of the United States in the affairs of Latin American countries, again because he felt that the United States was a force for good in those countries. And when he became president, in the first term of his presidency, he intervened quite forcefully in Mexican affairs, often, I think, on rather shaky grounds, but he felt that he was doing the right thing. As he said to a British diplomat, "I'm going to teach the South American republics to elect good men." And this is an odd view for a Democrat, but he felt that he was carrying out, in a sense, a mission in God's work. And he said of Mexico, when the United States sent troops into Mexico, "We have gone to Mexico to serve mankind if we can find the way. We do not want to fight the Mexicans." Now, if you were a Mexican, you might see this a bit differently. So this is the man who's president of the United States when the war breaks out, someone who is prepared to use American power where he sees it as necessary to do good, and also, of course, I think it must be admitted, to defend American interests. He certainly felt that in dealing with the Caribbean Basin and dealing with Mexico, the United States had every right to defend the interests of American missionaries or American business or American strategic interests. He did not, in 1914, I think, see the United States as playing a larger role in the world. He was at that stage still very much focused on domestic reforms and was carrying out a very ambitious program of domestic reforms. But when the war broke out, he was horrified, like many were, distracted, of course, by the fact that his wife was dying in those first days of August as Europe was going into the First World War. But he took himself away from her deathbed and sent out a note, which unfortunately was not paid attention to the different sides as they moved towards war, offering to act as a mediator. The note was not answered. By this point, the European nations had determined on war and were sliding towards war. The war started, and there were those in the United States who said very forcefully that the United States should get involved, Theodore Roosevelt among them. There were also those on the other side who said equally forcefully that the United States should not get involved under any circumstances. And there was also a considerable debate about if the United States were to get involved, on what side should it get involved. It was by no means a foregone conclusion that the United States would intervene on the side of the Allies, on the side of Britain, France, subsequently Italy, and Russia. And I think there were a number of reasons for this. There were large sections of the population in the United States which had no particular love, in particular for Britain. A large Irish population, which was not prepared to support the United States going in on the British side. And there were all those who had fled Tsarist autocracy who had fled Russia for very good reason and who had moved to the United States and saw no reason to support an autocracy. And I think a lot of good Democrats, whether or not, small d Democrats, whether or not they had family who'd come from Russia, did not feel comfortable with the United States supporting a country that was known for being thoroughly undemocratic and autocratic. There was also a large population of German descent in the United States, many of whom, if they were not prepared to advocate that the United States join on the German side, were certainly not willing to see the United States fight a country for which they still had a good deal of affection. And so as the war broke out, I think there was division in public opinion in the United States. Fair to say, although this was, of course, before public opinion polls, that probably the majority of Americans hoped that the United States could stay out of the war. They looked at what was happening in Europe with horror, particularly as the war developed, as it seemed that what had been promised to be a short war was going to turn into this hideous war of attrition that was going to drag on and on and on. A lot of Americans looked at Europe and thought, why are they doing it? With a sense of bewilderment, shock, horror that the Europeans seemed intent on destroying their own civilization. And so I think initially, at least in the first year of the war, there was, if you can gauge American public opinion, I think the feeling was that the United States should stay out. But a number of factors, some of them outside Wilson's control and sometimes inside his control, began to push the United States gradually towards the Allied side. Wilson himself was probably more sympathetic to the Allies than he was to the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary and their other allies, the Ottoman Empire, Bulgaria, and so on. I think he hadn't visited Europe much, but he had spent time in Britain. He had studied British history. He was a great admirer of the development of constitutionalism in Britain and the development of liberal thinking in Britain. And he felt that on balance, the Allied side was the better side. And so from the beginning, when there was a question of doing something that might favor the Allied side or might favor the Central Powers, Wilson tended, although not always, to come down on the side of the Allied side. And so, for example, on the issue of loans to belligerents, this was a rather thorny issue. Should those fighting be able to borrow money in the United States? His Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, was initially for a ban on both sides, which he argued, I think, with some justification, was true neutrality, that if you're going to be neutral, then you should not lend to either side. But there was pressure from business, from banks, which did actually want to lend, and the people they were probably going to lend to were the Allies, because the Allies were in a better position to borrow. The State Department was also in favor of making loans to the Allies. And by the late fall of 1914, Wilson had ordered the State Department and ordered Bryan to make it possible for the Allies to borrow in the United States. And as Bryan quite, I think, correctly argued, this was in fact tilting towards the Allies. The loans to the Allies were in fact going to increase steadily over the next years, to the point that by 1917, the United States, mostly private interests, had lent some $7 billion to the Allies. And so gradually, at least financially, the United States became more and more committed to the Allies, and Wilson did nothing to stop it and in fact facilitated it. The war also had a favorable economic impact on the United States because the Allies were in a position to order a great deal of war material from the United States. Most of what was being sold to the belligerents was being sold to the Allies rather than to the Germans. The war also gave an opportunity for American business to begin to move in on markets that had hitherto been the preserve of countries such as the British or the French. And so in many ways, the war was an economic benefit to the United States. It brought full employment. It brought an expansion in American exports. Just to give you one statistic, in 1914, U.S. exports to Europe were some $500 million, going, some of them to Germany, but again, the bulk going to the Allied powers. By 1917, U.S. export was $3.5 billion. So there's a very marked increase during the war, which doesn't commit the United States to the Allies, but does entangle the United States more and more economically, both through the loans and through the exports with the Allies. The United States was also pushed towards the Allied side by what the Germans did. And it wasn't that the British didn't irritate the United States. The great British weapon was the Naval Blockade, and the British imposed a naval blockade on Germany. They began to disrupt neutral trade being carried in neutral shipping to Germany, which began to irritate, of course, American public opinion when American ships were stopped, when American cargoes were seized on the grounds that they could be used for war, that they were therefore contraband. And this remained a constant irritant in the relations between the United States and the Allies, particularly between the United States and Britain. But on the whole, it was Germany that managed to enrage American public opinion much more than Britain did. And there were a number of reasons for this. The Germans, increasingly as the war went on, found their policy or allowed their policy to be made by the military. And the military, the German military, like military everywhere, tended to see very much in terms, see what they were doing very much in terms of winning the war. And they tended to ignore or downplay political factors. And this, you can see right at the beginning of the war, the Germans, for military reasons, invaded the neutral country of Belgium, whose neutrality had been guaranteed by a number of European states, including Germany itself. And so what Germany is doing is breaking its own guarantee to Belgium, invading a very small country, and the German invasion of Belgium was going to help very significantly to tilt American opinion against Germany. It really outweighed by far the irritants of the British blockade. Irritating though those were, increasingly American public opinion began to see Germany as something that had become dominated by militarists, which was running out of control, which was not obeying the laws of civilized warfare. And there were going to be several incidents in the invasion of Belgium which really shocked American opinion and opinion elsewhere. The Germans behaved with increasing brutality in Belgium. They were enraged, the German military were enraged when the Belgians decided to resist, and they began to round up Belgian civilians, use them for forced labor in Germany, and began as a sort of warning occasionally to shoot a number of Belgian civilians, in spite of the fact that this was quite contrary to the rules of war. It is fairly clear that the Germans also burnt a large part of the very ancient city of Louvain in Belgium, including a very old library which contained a great many treasures of the European past. And this really shocked American public opinion, again, as it shocked opinion around the world. This seemed an act of barbarism, an act against civilization. One German later on said that the two things that really swayed American public opinion against us were Louvain and the Lusitania. And I think there's something in this. In 1915, when German submarines sank the British line of the Lusitania, a large number of civilians, of course, were drowned, including a number of Americans, and this again was a real shock to American public opinion. And so you can see a gradual shift in American opinion, which Wilson certainly does, I think, nothing to stop, and in fact probably shares towards the Allied side. But this, of course, is a very long way from saying that the United States should be involved in the war. Wilson's own view was that we shouldn't be involved, that this is not a war that involves us, and on several occasions he offered his services or the services of the United States as a mediator. While this was happening, there was also debate within the United States about whether the United States should get more prepared for war. Should the United States up its military preparations in a world that was increasingly turbulent? And this was something that, again, divided American public opinion, but it was something, again, that Woodrow Wilson himself felt had to be done. That the United States, he argued, could not take the chance in a world that was at war of not being prepared militarily. He cast this in terms of being prepared against Mexico, in terms of continental defense, but that could be stretched to mean preparedness in terms of naval preparedness in the Atlantic, for example. I mean, there was a fear, increasingly in the United States, that if Germany won in Europe, that it would be a Europe inimical, hostile to the United States, and that the United States would then find itself in a position where it would be more vulnerable. Eventually, as technology was clearly changing and advancing, it would become more vulnerable to threats from Europe. In any case, on December the 15th, in December 1915, Wilson, in his State of the Union speech, talked it was very focused on military preparedness. He developed a new and approved a New Year 5-year plan for the Navy, which was approved by the Senate. In June 1916, after a great deal of debate in Congress, a National Defense Act was approved, which increased the Army to some 223,000 people. And it had been an army of less than 70,000 people, so this was a very, very marked increase. Again, this was cast in terms of defense of the United States, not of getting into war. I think you can see the similarities between the sort of debate that took place in the United States before 1941. A similar debate that the United States doesn't want to get involved in war, doesn't approve of the war, doesn't want to choose sides, but nevertheless should look out for itself in a world that is becoming very, very difficult. What you also got was an interesting debate in the United States about what the proper role for the United States should be in the world. And it's a debate which I think has recurred throughout the history of the United States. I think we see it again today. A debate about whether the United States should be internationalist, whether it should actively get involved in the world for any number of reasons, whether to promote American safety and security, whether to promote American economic interests, or whether to promote American values. These debates go right back to the founding of the Republic, and I think will continue. Or whether the United States should withdraw from the world, look after itself first, and protect itself, and not let the rest of the world impinge upon it. It's in this debate in the First World War that the word isolationist first enters the vocabulary, a word, of course, which is still very much with us today. Well, you probably all know what happened. The war drags on. The United States is more and more involved economically. American opinion is debating what the United States should be doing. Wilson runs in 1916 on a platform of keeping the United States out of the war. We will be too proud to fight, he said. He kept us out of the war was what the Democrats said when Wilson won, and this was very much the platform he ran on. Again, I think there's a real parallel here with Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1940, again, arguing that he was the one who could keep the United States out of the war. In the end, what brought the United States in, I think, was both this gradual shift in public opinion, which wouldn't have been enough to do, but I think really it was what the Germans did. The Germans behaved in a way that I can only describe as folly, extremely short-sighted. The German Supreme Command by 1917 was virtually in command of the German state. It had set up something very close to a military dictatorship, and it had been pressing to renew unrestricted submarine warfare. It had stopped in 1915 after an American ship had been sunk, and there was huge protest in the United States, and the German government at the time had recognized that unrestricted submarine warfare, where submarines could fire on any shipping approaching British shores, whether neutral, British or not, was not helping Germany. The High Command had been pressing for the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, and in January 1917 they got their wish. And so the sinkings and the loss of American lives began to go up, and American opinion begins now to harden. In 1917, beginning of 1917, Wilson talks to the Senate. He's still hoping to keep the United States out of the war, but what's, I think, very significant is he's beginning to sketch a world after the war, beginning to take an active role in defining what that world should look like. Now, that's not the same as going into the war, but what it is, I think, is indicating that the United States, at least as far as Wilson is concerned, and there's quite a lot of support for this, is moving to a position of saying the world is going to be a very different place and we ought to have a say in it. And once you think you ought to have a say in the world, then you are more likely to want to get involved. It's in this address to the Senate in January 1917 that he talks about peace without victory. He talks for the first time about how the world might develop a community of powers to replace the old balance of power, and begins to sketch out some of his ideas for a new way of managing international relations. Well, the Germans do their best to make up American minds. They do not only do they resume unrestricted submarine warfare, but they send a telegram to the Mexican government, which is known as the Zimmermann telegram, after the foreign secretary who sends it. And what Herr Zimmermann sends to the Mexican government is a telegram saying, we think you probably, I'm paraphrasing, but you would probably like to have back the territory which the United States took from you in the 19th century. We suggest that you declare war on the United States. We can probably persuade Japan to join in, and we will certainly support you. Now, the Germans had to send this telegram on British cables because the British had cut all the German telegraph cables to the New World, but it was coded, but the British had broken the German code. And so the British decode this cable, look at it, realize they have a really hot potato here, sit on it for a time being as they decide to try what they will do with it, and in February they take it to Woodrow Wilson. And you can imagine his reaction. I mean, this is treachery of the First Order. This is now a menace to the security of the United States right there on the southern border of the United States. And so from that point on, it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that the United States will enter the war on the Allied side. What also makes it easier for the United States to contemplate doing this is that in February 1917, there's also a revolution in Russia. This is not yet the Bolshevik Revolution. This is the first revolution which overthrows the Tsarist regime, and a constitutional and democratic government is set up. And so one of the main objections that used to come from liberals and people who were profoundly democratic to joining on the Allied side, that the Allies included this autocratic power, now suddenly is removed. And so in April, to cut a long and quite complicated story short, Wilson goes to Congress and asks for a declaration of war. It's one of his best speeches. He does so not in a triumphant way. He does it in a very somber way. The United States, he says, is entering into a war which is going to cost it. It's going to lose. It's going to suffer. It's going to suffer the loss of life. He himself has a heavy heart, but what he hopes is that the war will end in producing a better world. And what he hoped privately, and said to many, that he hoped it would bring the American people together, educate them about international issues and their responsibility towards the war. He was, I wouldn't say a great war leader, but I think he understood very clearly what needed to be done in war. He understood the importance of mobilizing the nation for war. The day after he signed the declaration of war, he made a list, which he called his program, and he said, we need clearly to up the measures for war. We need to increase the size of the Army and Navy. We need to pass all necessary legislation to put the country in a thorough state of defense and preparation for action. We need, and this is one of the more controversial things he did, and he in fact did it, we need to control public speech and expression carefully. We need to make sure that we do not have spies and we do not suffer espionage at home. And this, I think, is one of the areas which is very contentious about those days of the presidency, because there is a real curtailment of civil liberties. There's a good deal of spying on American citizens, and I think Woodrow Wilson himself, it could be said, and I would agree, did not do enough to defend very basic civil liberties. He allowed, furthermore, attacks on ethnic minorities. He allowed attacks on unions. He allowed increasing and often very rigid segregation in the armed forces. So as a war leader, I think he did a lot to bring the United States together, but you can also look at areas where he didn't. He also recognized that the war was going to have to be financed, and he put Bernard Baruch in charge of the War and Industries Board, and Baruch and others tried to coordinate, without, I would say, a great deal of success, American industrial output, but also managed to raise a great deal of money through the sale of bonds, which came to be known as Liberty Loans. Unlike some of his predecessors, unlike Theodore Roosevelt, he was not himself particularly interested in things military. And he did not, on the whole, intervene in either making strategy. He allowed strategy for winning the war to be made by the Allies, who now had a coherent command and a supreme commander. But he was prepared to support General Pershing when Pershing insisted that the United States play an independent role and that American forces play an independent role. And Wilson's attitude seems to be more that he would allow Pershing, once appointed, to do what he felt best. And so you get very little interference by Wilson in the direction of the war. He doesn't play the sort of role that Churchill is going to play in England in the Second World War, or Roosevelt is obliged to play in the Second World War. What he does do in the course of the war is continue to sketch out American war aims. On January the 18th, a year after his address, in which he talks about peace without victory, of course, January 8, 1918, he unveils the 14 points. And these are a more comprehensive statement of the sort of world he wants. He doesn't use self-determination in that speech, although that term is very much associated with him. It had been used a few days previously by the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, who had made a similar speech. It was suspected in the White House in order to preempt Wilson and to steal publicity from him, who knows. But Lloyd George had sketched out a liberal view of the post-war world in which he talked about self-determination. So although the term is now, I think, forever associated with Wilson, he does not use it initially all that much. It comes to be something that he uses later on. But in the 14 points, he talks about the sort of liberal world order he wants. A world in which there is open diplomacy. He talks about open covenants, openly arrived at. A lot of Americans and others blamed the war in Europe on secret agreements, secret diplomacy. And so there's the idea that relations between nations will now become transparent. That, in fact, doesn't last, because it turns out to be something that's very, very difficult to do. He talks about community of nations, collective security, and this, of course, is the forerunner of the League of Nations. He talks not about self-determination, but he talks about autonomy for the different parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He talks about helping Russia to find its way. He talks about disarmament, he talks about lowering trade barriers, and this is a very liberal international order, that if we can have collective security, if we can have disarmament, if we can link the world together through trade increasingly, then we will have a world that will be safer, and a world, as he said, of course, will be safe for democracy. And he continued to elaborate on his views of the post-war world in the last months and year of the war. Increasingly, too, and you can see it in his private conversation, his speeches, he tends to blame what he calls German militarism for a lot of the war. I mean, he doesn't blame Germany itself, although it certainly is very close to that, but he is increasingly very vehement against what he calls Prussian or German militarism, the rampant ascendancy of the military, the ascendancy of military values. These, he says, must be removed from Germany before Germany can be rehabilitated and reintegrated into the community of nations. And so in spite of what later historians have said, he was not prepared to be soft with Germany. He was prepared to chastise Germany, to amend Germany, to make Germany a better place. Then and only then would Germany be fit to be admitted into the community of nations. The war ended, as you know, very quickly. The Germans made one last great push in the summer of 1918, but they had by this point run out of steam. And I think the fact that there were now 1 million Americans in Europe and more in training camps, 2 million more in training camps in the United States, that tremendous American support, material, manpower, a fresh approach to the war was now counting against Germany. The Germans simply crumbled. They were no longer capable of sustaining the war. The German home front was collapsing. And by the autumn of 1918, German allies were beginning to fall away. And so the Germans, the high command, who have continued to assure the German civilian government, this rather shadowish civilian government, which has by now very little power, they've continued to assure the civilian government that all is going well, suddenly panic at the end of September and say, we have to get an armistice. We've had it. We can't fight on. And so the German government, hoping, I think, that they might get gentler treatment from the United States because of the sorts of speeches that Woodrow Wilson has been making, which have been very well reported in Germany, send an open note to Woodrow Wilson asking him to broker an armistice. And Wilson, much to the fury of his European partners, he will never call them allies. He always says the United States is an associate power. But much to the fury of the British and the French, begins to negotiate through open communications which are published in newspapers with the Germans. And this is not something that the British and the French particularly approve of, but they find themselves preempted by what the Germans in the first place have done and by what Wilson does. And so the armistice is made really in spite of what the British and the French want. I mean, on the British and French side, there is a sentiment that it is probably better to go on and that Germany needs to be thoroughly defeated. And there are certainly those in the United States who are arguing this as well. Teddy Roosevelt is saying, and so is Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, that unless Germany is utterly defeated, unless Germany knows it's been defeated, there will only be the seeds of trouble for the future. Sometimes I think they were right. It's a very, very difficult debate. Very interesting. You will remember that in the Second World War, Roosevelt and Churchill decided on unconditional surrender as their policy. They were not going to have any conditional surrender, as there was in the First World War. So the armistice was made. It was made in such a way that Germany continued as a state. It accepted that Germany would continue to be a state, although there had been some talk of breaking it up into its component parts. And Germany, on the whole, did not come badly out of that armistice. The government had by this point been replaced by a more or less democratic government. German soil was not occupied except for a very small bit in the west, on the west bank of the Rhine. And this, perhaps, led to trouble in the future. I would argue that it did. Most Germans never really felt they'd been defeated. They never saw the consequences of defeat. And the high command, who had so rapidly and in such a panic-stricken fashion demanded that their government ask for an armistice, a month later was saying, oh, we could have fought on. We don't know why the government asked for the armistice. They panicked. We didn't. And they began very sedulously, with the support of a lot of the right in Germany, to promote this pernicious myth that Germany had been stabbed in the back, that it had never been defeated on the battlefield. It had been stabbed in the back by traitors at home. And the traitors included liberals, communists, socialists, and unfortunately Jews. And this became a very, very dangerous founding myth, which grew in power rather than lessening in the 1920s and 1930s. So the war ends on November the 11th, 1918, and the question now is what sort of peace will be made. And as Professor Loeffler mentioned, Wilson broke with precedent by coming himself to the peace conference that was going to take place in Paris. He was heavily criticized for it at the time. I think he was actually right to go because this was a very, very important conference. The world had, in many ways, quite literally been turned upside down by the war, and Europe and much of the rest of the world was in turmoil. 4 empires had disappeared or were in process of disappearing. Germany was falling to pieces, was losing territories which it had conquered a century earlier, losing its Polish territories, losing its colonies. The Ottoman Empire was going to disappear by November 19, or shortly after November 11th, 1918. The Austro-Hungarian Empire had already disappeared. It was falling into its different component pieces, and new nations were struggling to be born in the wreckage of that. And Russia had had both an internal revolution and was losing an empire. The states on the periphery of Russia were now declaring their independence. States such as Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Ukraine tried and succeeded very briefly in its independence. Georgia, Azerbaijan, Russia was both an empire and a regime, and both were splintering in the aftermath of that great war. And so there were huge questions that the world had to settle. What was the shape of Europe going to be like? What was the shape of the Middle East going to be like? Because as the Ottoman Empire fell to pieces, suddenly all the Arab territories, vast Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire, were now up for grabs of some sort. There were colonies to be disposed of in Africa, in the South Pacific. There were questions to be settled in the Far East. And there was also a very real danger that many felt at the time that Europe and the world were going to plunge into even more revolution. The second revolution in Russia, the Revolution of November 1917, had seen a very small and fanatical splinter group in the Bolsheviks take over, and there were fears that that revolution would be followed elsewhere, and some evidence that it would be. There was a communist revolution in Bavaria. It only lasted for a week, but it was enough to worry people. There was a communist revolution in Hungary, which lasted for 6 months. There were attempted communist insurrections in Italy, in France, general strikes, often very militant ones, in Britain, in Canada. So there were troubles around the world, and I think there was a very real fear that 1918 was not the end of something, it was the beginning of another even more dreadful period in human history. And so I think Wilson was absolutely right to go to Paris. I think where he made a mistake was in the way he chose his delegation. He did not include any Republicans. Well, he included one nominal Republican who he paid absolutely no attention to. And this, I think, was wrong. He also fought the 1918 congressional election as a vote of confidence in himself. He made the making of peace a partisan affair, and I think, again, you can criticize him for that. And I think it's very striking that FDR in 1945 made sure that any peace arrangements he made, any international conferences he went to before he died in 1945 were bipartisan, that he had bipartisan support for what he was trying to do. I think Wilson was right to go to Paris. He's been blamed ever since for much that went wrong. I mean, there are many views of Wilson in Paris. There's Wilson, the Messiah, who came from the United States with the gift of peace and international fellowship and was greeted by black-hearted, cynical people in Europe who took his gift and destroyed it. That was promulgated by people like Ray Stannard Baker, that Wilson was too good for the Europeans, that the Europeans simply didn't understand what it was he was offering, that they were sunk in their old ways of doing things. My own view is that is wrong. Many Europeans supported what Wilson was trying to do. They had, after all, seen firsthand, and many of them had survived, what the war had done to their society. And so I think for a lot of Europeans, Wilson offered promise, offered hope, and many of the ideas he was bringing with him were ideas that had been in Europe for a long time. And these were not just ideas that he had come up with. These were ideas, for example, that you should have collective security, were ideas that had been talked about throughout the 19th century in Europe. Ideas of international arbitrations to try and settle disputes among nations. These were things that had been talked about and indeed had been tried. International free trade. These, again, were ideas that had been talked about. Disarmament. There'd been 2 huge disarmament conferences in The Hague before 1914. They hadn't succeeded, but the ideas certainly were there. And so I think the view that Wilson was too good for Europe is wrong. I think also the view that Wilson was a total incompetent at Paris is wrong. This is a view that was promulgated, among others, by John Maynard Keynes, the very clever young British economist who was there, who was very critical of everyone who was in Paris. He portrays them as dreadful, cynical old men who don't know what they're doing. Clemenceau, the French prime minister, he describes as a sort of giant chimpanzee in human form who sits there with hooded eyes thinking only of revenge on Germany, which is not true. Clemenceau knew, whatever he thought of the Germans, that France was going to have to work with them at some point, at some level. He portrays David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, as a half goat, half man coming out of the Welsh mists who weaves spells around Wilson. And he portrays Wilson as someone blindfolded who spun round and round and round until he doesn't know whether he's coming or going. And this is not true. I think Wilson made mistakes. They all did. I think he assumed that the League could do too much. Whenever a question came up, he said, look, as long as we get the League up and running, it will sort it out. The League will be able to deal with it. I think he had too much optimism, but I think he was bringing something very important. He was bringing to the forefront of public opinion another way of looking at the world, another way of trying to run the world. And I think this was enormously important, particularly when you could see what had happened. I think, however, for all the, I think, very great strength of Wilson's vision, and I think there was real support in Europe for it, he was doing and trying to do something that was probably impossible. I take a view of the Paris Peace Conference with, my view is that it made mistakes, that it did not create a stable world, but that it probably couldn't have done much better. The conditions for a lasting peace was simply not there. And it's all very well to say that those people sitting in Paris should have sorted the world out. The world was not in a condition to be sorted out. It was very different in 1815 when the powers met at the Congress of Vienna to try to sort out the aftermath of the French Wars of Revolution and then the Napoleonic Wars. By 1815, Europe was tired. It didn't want any more war. Nobody wanted any more war. In 1918, that wasn't true. Many people didn't want war. A lot of people were still fighting. There were a whole series of small wars after 1918. Winston Churchill called them the Wars of the Pygmies. Wars between Poland and Czechoslovakia, wars between Poland and Ukraine, wars in the Middle East, wars in the southern parts of Europe. So this was not a peaceful world. This was not a world that was yet ready for peace. What's more, it was a world in which revolutionary feelings were running high. The Russian Revolution had set off revolutionary fervor around Europe, and it was not clear where that was going to end. And it was a world in which nationalisms, particularly ethnic nationalisms, were running high. The collapse of the empires meant that peoples who'd been within those empires, who increasingly had been defining themselves as nations, suddenly saw an open door, suddenly saw an attempt to establish nations of their own. The trouble was that establishing a nation with national boundaries was not easy because there were no clear markers of where those boundaries should be. The center of Europe had a mix of peoples. Nationalities were so mixed up that you would have a Hungarian village next to a German village. How did you draw a reasonable boundary? There was no way of putting all German speakers in a neat little box and putting all Czech speakers in another neat box or putting all Hungarian speakers in another neat box. Nor were there, in many cases, clearly defined historic boundaries. Because European history had seen so much, I mean, there's too much of it, and for so many centuries, boundaries had come and gone. What was the legitimate boundary? They all called on history. They all said, history shows that this should be the extent of our nation. But human nature being what it is, what they called on was the time their nation had been biggest in the past. And so the Bulgarians looked back to, say, the 14th century when they'd been quite big. The Serbs looked back a bit earlier when they'd been even bigger. And of course, they were often claiming the same bits of territory. And you can just imagine what the Greeks did. Or the Italians. You know, they could go even further back with even more justification. And so I would argue that it wasn't Wilson's fault, it wasn't Lloyd George's fault, it wasn't Clemenceau's fault that a lasting peace was not built. The circumstances were not ripe for it. And they tried. They tried very hard. They brought their experts. This was one of the times when, for better or worse, people like me, history professors, were invited to go along and give their views on how the borders should be drawn. This is the beginning of the use of experts in international diplomacy. And the committees worked very hard, and they had delegations who came in with maps to show that they should have this piece of territory rather than someone else. The Americans, on the whole, in those committees were pretty reasonable. They tried to draw rational boundaries. They tried to draw boundaries that would give countries a fighting chance of surviving. They tried to make them sort of economically stable. They tried to incorporate railway networks. But they tried also to resist the more outlandish claims. And the Americans, I think, on the whole, played a very reasonable part. The trouble was they were dealing with something that was not reasonable. Ethnic nationalism wasn't by its nature reasonable, and it wasn't going to be settled very easily. National self-determination, in the end, what did it mean? Robert Lansing, who was Wilson's Secretary of State, whom he treated, I think, very badly and didn't like at all, Robert Lansing said, well, how do you define an ethnic nation? What about the people within it who don't want to be part of it? Are they an ethnic nation too? And how small can you get? Can you keep subdividing it until you get smaller and smaller nations? And how can they survive? How can they survive in an independent world? Wilson himself told the Senate at the end of 1919 that he had come to regret that he ever uttered the words national self-determination. He said, I didn't foresee what trouble it would cause. And so you look at the Paris Peace Conference, I'm inclined to say that Wilson and the rest of them did the best job they could. Nevertheless, you can, and I'll just finish with this, there are things you can criticize about what Wilson, and you can certainly criticize what some of the others did. He was right, I think, to insist on negotiating the League Covenant first. His allies didn't, or his associates didn't want to do that, but he said, we've got to get the covenant first. And so the covenant was the first part of the treaty with Germany to be written, and then was going to be put into all the other treaties as well. There is certainly grounds to criticize. One of the things I would criticize is the way he handled the Japanese request. Japan was a new nation in the world order. It was part of the liberal world order. The Japanese wanted to be part of a liberal international order, but what they wanted was to be recognized. And they were very sensitive about the fact that their nationals had been denied entry into the United States, into Canada, into Australia on racial grounds. And so what they wanted written into the League Covenant was a phrase, it came to be known as the Racial Equality Clause, which said there should be no discrimination on the basis of religion or nationality. And Wilson ruled it out on a rather feeble technicality. He was afraid of losing votes from the West Coast and felt that if he challenged the fears on the West Coast, if he didn't go along with what the West Coast wanted, that is exclusion of Asian immigration, then he would have more trouble getting the treaty through Congress. I think he was wrong on this because it served to poison relations in the long term with Japan. I think he was also wrong, but it was not him alone, when China came to the peace conference, and China and Japan were both allies in the First World War. And the Chinese said, well, now that Germany has been defeated, we would like back what had been German concessions in China. And the Japanese said, we also have a claim on those because we helped to defeat Germany. And the Allies, and Wilson certainly could have stopped it, gave German concessions in China to the Japanese. And it infuriated the Chinese. It helped to spur the growth and the founding and then the growth of the Chinese Communist Party, and helped to turn China again away from a liberal international order. As one young Chinese intellectual said, he said, we used to trust people like Wilson, now we think they're just great liars. And so I think you can look at part of what Wilson did for expediency and argue that it was going to have very serious long-term consequences. Can you blame him for not foreseeing it? No, perhaps you can't. What I think in the end he felt, and Lloyd George and Clemenceau all felt, that the treaty was the best they could have got. Was it too harsh on Germany? I would argue not, but this is perhaps something we can talk about again. I think the final criticism I would make of Wilson is that he didn't make it possible for the treaty to go through Congress. He came back, there was opposition, but as far as we know, and again this was before public opinion polls, American public opinion, if anything, was in favor of the United States joining the League. The Literary Review did a survey, as it often did, of editors and of its readers, and opinion was, I think, 2 to 1, over 2 to 1 in favor of the U.S. joining the League. And there was an organization to promote American membership of the League, which had far more members than a parallel organization to oppose American membership of the League. I think in the end, why the treaty failed was because Wilson was not prepared to compromise. He was not prepared to accept the reservations which came attached to the treaty as it made its way through the Senate. He ordered his Democrats to vote against the treaty as amended. And so the treaty, and so therefore American membership of the League, was defeated by a combination of Democrat and Republican votes. You can argue, and some would, that Wilson was no longer the man he'd been. He'd suffered a dreadful stroke in the fall of 1919 in the course of this long trip across the country to try and get support for the League. And he had become both isolated and extremely stubborn. So on the balance, my own view is that Wilson was not the savior of the world that people hoped he would be, but he was not the bamboozled and blindfolded figure spun around that the people like Keynes thought he was. He was a complicated man. He presided over the United States at a complicated time in a complicated world. His record is mixed, but given those circumstances, I think anyone's record would have been mixed. Thanks.
Margaret, thank you. That was a wonderful survey of the United States and Wilson in War and Peace. So I neglected to say when I introduced you that you're a Canadian by birth, and you've been in England for many years. Most Americans think of Woodrow Wilson as a great idealist, and that's infused both with respect and also with a little bit of contempt that he was a great idealist. Do you think Wilson was a great idealist?
Yes, I do. And I think you needed great idealists then, and we probably need them now. I mean, this view that we can muddle along, with each nation in a dog-eat-dog world, I don't think is going to work. I think the consequences can be so dreadful that we need to think of other ways of thinking. I mean, perhaps this is a very Canadian view, because we're a small power, but we see cooperation with other nations as a way for security and safety in the world. And, conflicts on the scale of the First World War, much less the Second World War, and let's hope there'll never be that scale again, are so damaging to us all that I think it's actually not idealistic to try and build ways of preventing those. It's actually very practical.
But he's often viewed as idealistic because when he comes back to the U.S., he refuses to compromise. Yeah. And much of what we think about Wilson, I think, stems from that intransigence about compromising with his domestic foes. Yeah. Some people who don't think he was an idealist point to the fact that actually when he was negotiating in Paris, as you point out many times, he was a remarkable compromiser. Yeah. I mean, in fact, some of his domestic opponents ridiculed him precisely because he had compromised too much. Yeah. And had betrayed his own principles again and again and again during the negotiations in Paris. Yeah. Was he really a rigid idealist, or was he a pragmatic compromiser?
Well, I think he became more rigid when he was back in the United States, and I do think the consequences of the stroke are very important, and the fact that he was kept in pretty much isolation by his wife, that he was not either in a position to compromise or was not getting the right advice or was simply not capable of doing it. He did compromise in Paris, and I think you have to. I mean, the idea that you can go in and hold your ideals high and never make a compromise. I mean, he was dealing with other very powerful nations. And there's a tendency, I think, for people to read back the great power of the United States, which it certainly had by 1944-45, back to this period. Yes, it was a powerful country, but it was not the dominant power that it was going to be by 1944 or 1945. And Britain still had the biggest empire in the world. France was still a very considerable power. And so Wilson could not push them around in a way that Roosevelt, in the end, could get Churchill to do what he wanted. And so I think Wilson had to recognize that other nations had interests here. And there was a real problem over Germany. I mean, Wilson wanted a peace without retribution, although he felt very strongly that Germany should be punished in some way. I mean, the idea that Wilson was prepared to be sort of gentle with Germany, I think, is a wrong one. I mean, I think he thought Germany really did need to pay a price for what it had done. I mean, he shared the view that Germany had started the war. But it was easier for him to say, look, we shouldn't exact too much in the way of reparations from Germany because it wasn't going to hurt the United States. But the French had a real problem, and so did the British. I mean, the French looked at the north of France, where a lot of the war had been fought. Something like a quarter of all their industrial plants had been destroyed. Their mines had been destroyed. Their railways had been destroyed. Villages and towns had been destroyed. The French lost more men proportionally to their population than anyone else. And they looked across the border at Germany, which was relatively unscathed because virtually none of the war was fought on German soil except in the east. And they thought, why can the Germans go on living like this and we have to rebuild? And, why shouldn't the Germans pay? And Clemenceau said, and I think he was right, he said, I have to think of my public opinion. I mean, in democracies, you have to deal with what the public wants. And the French public were determined that Germany should pay. It probably wasn't sensible. And in the end, it was very difficult to get reparations out of Germany. But public opinion put Clemenceau in a position where he had very little choice. And the British had not bankrupted themselves, but they'd spent huge amounts on the war, lent huge amounts to their allies. And they said, well, they thought if the French and the Belgians are going to get recompense for the damage done to their land, what about us? And so the British managed to argue successfully that the pensions being paid to widows and orphans of soldiers should also be included in the bill. Now, you could say that Wilson shouldn't have gone along with this, but I think it was very difficult for him to go against his allies on this. And I think he really ran the risk of not getting a peace. I mean, what they were doing was drawing up the treaty with Germany. And if he had failed to compromise, it might well have broken down. Because this was something the French in particular were not prepared to compromise on. But what the French did do, and they often get blamed for being intransigent, they backed down on a lot. I mean, they backed down on occupying Germany. They backed down on long-term proposals to break Germany up. So the compromise was not just on Wilson's side. The French compromised too, the British compromised too. And it was a very difficult situation. I mean, the one thing Wilson might have contemplated, but he was against it and so were his advisors, and it would have been difficult, I think, was to cancel Allied debts to the United States. The Allies had borrowed some $9 billion from the United States to pay for the war. And that was one of the reasons they were so firm on getting reparations, because the British had lent to the French. They'd both lent to the Russians. Well, the Russians weren't paying anybody anything by this point because they'd canceled all debts. And so the British and the French and the Italians had huge war debts, which they were paying off to the United States or paying via Britain to the United States. And so that gave added impetus to them to want to extract reparations from Germany. Now, Keynes came up with a plan. He said, why don't we just cancel the whole lot? If the United States would cancel the debts, Britain and France can agree not to try and get reparations from Germany. It would be a lot better. And it probably would have been a lot better, but it was politically impossible, I think.
Inside the United States, you mean?
I think so. Well, possibly if the Wilson administration had gone for it, because in the Second World War, they did actually provide a lot of the financing for the Allied war effort without expecting to be repaid.
Yeah, well, that's a good experience of learning from the past.
Maybe learning from
right?
the past. Yeah.
So, I mean, I tend to agree with you that Wilson was an artful compromiser during the Paris deliberations, and everybody really compromised quite a bit. So the notions that we often have of Wilson, the rigid idealist, comes from when he returns home and he refuses to compromise with his adversaries. And as you say, and I think most historians have now pointed out, in fact, the best we can tell, Americans supported the League. It wasn't that Americans were isolationist in 1918, 1919. They supported America's role in the world. And it was a question of how to define what that role would be. So, one of the continuing debates in American foreign relations history is the question of, should Wilson have compromised with Lodge? And of course, once, he's stricken, he obviously that has a real impact on him physically and psychologically, and he becomes more intransigent. But even before then, before he shows every sign of not wanting to compromise at all. In fact, he shows a lot of contempt for his domestic adversaries, and of course this increases their contempt for him in turn. So how should we explain this, and should we be very critical? I mean, could we have had a constructive American role in the world if Wilson had been willing to make some compromise?
My own view is you could, and I think the world would have been a better place for it. Wilson did make compromises in Paris, but where he was very bad, as you've pointed out, was in compromises with the Republicans. And this was the side of Wilson's character which said, if you disagree with me, it's not just that you disagree, but there's something morally wrong with you. And he hated Lodge. He thought Lodge was evil. I mean, this wasn't just someone who happened to disagree with him. I looked again recently at the criticisms that Lodge made of the League Covenant. And these were not unreasonable. They're very reasonable. He's saying, should we bind ourselves in advance to support, action, in a conflict which we don't yet know what the conflict's going to be. I mean, these I thought were reasonable. And indeed, it's a debate that goes on. But Wilson simply treated Lodge as someone who was beyond the pale, and treated him it was very, very foolish. And he wouldn't talk to Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt typically wanted to go over to Europe leading his own regiment, and Wilson wouldn't even talk to him about it. What he could have done, he could have said, look, this is wonderful, and let's think about it. And Roosevelt was getting on. He wasn't that well. But he was not good at dealing with political opponents. I mean, he was very skillful at maneuvering. He was a very effective president in many ways. And you look at what he got through in the terms of domestic legislation in his first term. It's extraordinary.
And you can only do that by being a great compromiser and leader.
Yeah. But when it came to making the peace, he sort of had this vision, and he didn't believe that anyone who didn't have the vision was worth listening to. And and this is where FDR was so right. I mean, he made it bipartisan, the making of the peace, right from, and the war aims, right from the beginning. And Wilson didn't. And when he came back to the United States briefly during the peace conference, I mean, he was out of the United States until he came back on February the 14th for a month. And he didn't make any point. He wouldn't see Lodge. He wouldn't talk. And he went to Boston, which is Lodge's hometown, and made a sort of speech about his vision about those who don't agree with him, which is stupid. It was antagonistic. And he did even silly things. Like one of his daughters had a grandson, and he looked at this tiny infant. He said, "Oh, it's just like a senator. It keeps its mouth open the whole time and keeps its eyes shut." These are not. This was stupid.
Well, these are important lessons for Americans to think of. We tend to think that contemporary partisan acrimony is unique. And what we forget, for example, is in this critical period of time, just how acrimonious and poisonous politics was in the United States, and also how dismal the consequences were as a result of it, because there was possibility for compromise. Most Americans wanted, in some form, the United States to participate in the League or in an international organization. It didn't come about because of the intransigence and inflexibility of these people. It's true, by the way, as you're suggesting, of course, that Wilson had utmost contempt for Lodge. But it's also true that contempt was fully reciprocated. I mean, Lodge detested Wilson. These were two men who really loathed one another. I want to sort of shift the context of this conversation just for a few minutes. In the aftermath of World War II, the Treaty of Versailles, of course, was blamed for World War II. Nowadays, the Treaty of Versailles, not the Treaty of Versailles, but the peacemakers of 1919 and 1920 are usually criticized for the problems in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf today. And there's a huge amount of literature saying the problems in Iraq, for example, and in Syria today go back to the First World War. Would you be kind enough to sort of elaborate upon that and tell us what you think?
Well, I tend to think that events in the past cast a shadow, but you can't look at the event and then subtract everything that happens in between. So, the argument, just to talk about Europe for a second, that the Treaty of Versailles led directly to 1939. My question is, what was everyone doing for 20 years? What's other things are happening? And in the Middle East, it certainly is true that the settlement made in the Middle East enraged a lot of Arab opinion. Mostly elite opinion, except in Egypt, where there was a deeply rooted nationalist movement, but otherwise it was more elite opinion in cities like Damascus and Baghdad. But there was a sense among the Arabs that they had been promised independent Arab states and they'd been betrayed. And that, of course, fatally, I think, gets mixed up with the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine, which is seen as part of the same betrayal. And so the presence of the Jews in Palestine comes to be the symbol of betrayal of the Arabs and the meddling by outside powers in a way which, of course, doesn't help the Jews who are coming to Palestine. And so I do think what was done in 1919 and subsequent years, because the peace settlement in the Middle East took a while to work out, and the United States wasn't much involved. I mean, part of the withdrawal when Wilson became sick was the United States no longer took much interest. It no longer had strong interest there. It wasn't an ideal settlement. Again, you know, it's difficult. This was a time of empire, and people making decisions in the West tended to think they could dispose of peoples around the world as they wished. And it would have perhaps taken more enlightened leaders, more 20th century leaders rather than 19th century leaders, which is what Lloyd George and Clemenceau still really were, to recognize that you couldn't go on parceling out people like this. I mean, one of the things Wilson did do, which I think had some consequence, was that he got written into the League of Nations the issue, the mandates that, and this was something he'd said also in the 14 points and subsequent speeches, that you cannot parcel out people and hand them around without consulting them or without thinking of their interests. And so when the Middle East territories and the African colonies of Germany and so on were disposed of, they were not given directly to the victors. They were handed over as mandates of the League of Nations. In other words, Britain and France, Australia and South Africa were given mandates to run these bits of territories, and they had to report to the League of Nations. So there's a step forward at any rate, that these territories have to be administered in some form of international system for the benefit of the people living there. Now, a lot of people saw that as simply cynical Western imperialism, and I think a lot of it was, but nevertheless there's an important idea introduced here. The problem with the Middle East, I think, and it's something I keep thinking about, is, again, it was the sort of problem you had in the center of Europe. How could you draw rational boundaries to make rational states? The peoples were mixed. You couldn't have ethnic states. You couldn't, even drawing a Kurdish state would have been difficult, because the peoples are so mixed. In what became Iraq, you had Persians, you had Kurds, you had Arabs, you had Jews. I mean, Baghdad was a very Jewish city in 1919. So you couldn't make ethnically based states. What could you make? And in Iraq, I think Iraq is more defensible than the borders of Syria. Iraq was geographically defensible. It was 3 provinces of the Ottoman Empire, which had been sometimes collectively treated. Certainly Baghdad was seen as a senior province. And geographically, there's a sort of unity there. I mean, you come down the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates. Mesopotamia did have some sort of historical presence. And, there was a possibility, I think, and I've talked to people who know Iraqi history much better than I do, there was a possibility that Iraq could have developed as a reasonable country within those boundaries. But there were accidents, as often happens in history. Faisal, who turned out to be a very good king, died early. His son was a useless playboy who killed himself in a car accident, and then there was a little boy with a not very good regent. So that was a problem. And then you got a series of, political movements in Iraq, the Ba'athist movement, which was deeply intolerant, and then you had a series of military coups. Now, given a different sort of history and maybe a few different accidents, Iraq might have developed in a different way. And, I've always found the argument that if you draw boundaries, you can't expect a country to grow within it. And, if you look at the boundaries of Canada, they couldn't be more artificial. It's just one straight line from the end of the Great Lakes out to the west coast. But a country has grown within those borders. And, you look at many African countries, and national feeling has developed. So whether things could have turned out differently, Iraq, I think, was hopeful. Syria was cursed from the beginning because the French took a large bit of Syria and popped it into Lebanon, which the Syrians never forgot. Mm-hmm. Egypt has become a functioning country. God knows it's got problems, but it was geographically made sense. Libya never made sense. It was 2 different provinces of the Ottoman Empire which were shoved together, and I think never very happily. So yes, you can blame a lot on what happened in 1919, but I don't think you can blame everything. And of course, the trouble with the Middle East is where it is. It is at a crossroads. It's constantly being meddled with by outside powers. The Cold War didn't help. Right.
Well, one of the things we so admire about your work is that you're able to put policy makers in the context of their time and really understand the constraints under which they operate and the limits of the options. So I think we should take 10 minutes or so now to open it up for questions. I know there are some people here who, yeah.
Now I have the pleasure of calling.
Yeah, 1 second, there's a microphone here.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I had a
Why don't
chance
you
to
introduce
speak
yourself?
to I'm Fred Hitz, and what I wanted to ask you about, and had a chance to chat with you before the lecture, is this issue of, and you said a lot about it, I think quite in quite graphic terms, Was Wilson ill when he went to the conference? You make a point of the fact that he had, although he did not choose a Republican to be member of the delegation, he had some pretty fancy people, some pretty fancy minds on board the boat. And he didn't really meet with them much. And then when he got to Europe, he was caught up in the celebration of the 14 points and the league, that sort of thing. Was he somebody who'd had a heart event or something before it really collapsed later in the spring, do you think?
I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of speculation. It's a good question. There's a lot of speculation about Wilson's health, and he tended to have these moments of total collapse. This was even before he became president. There'd be times when he'd suddenly have terrible trouble with his vision, not be able to see. Doctors weren't quite sure what it was. I mean, I'm not a doctor, but whether this was a thrombosis, whether, his health was always something of an issue. And in Paris, I mean, the work would have really done it for most of us, because I mean they were at it from morning till night, and the pressures on them were absolutely huge. And there's a real sense of urgency. If we don't get a peace cobbled together, the world could really get into an even worse state. And there was this incident in Paris after he'd come back from the United States where he had what was described as flu, and that could have covered a number of things, and was very, very sick. And there is some speculation, and the Arthur Link, in editing the Wilson papers at Princeton, got doctors to look at the evidence, and there's a long sort of thing in one of the many volumes, which I can't recall the details of now, but said that it could have been a stroke. He did begin to behave a bit erratically after that episode. I mean, there was this one curious episode where he came into the room with one of his secretaries, and he said, "I don't like the way these chairs are arranged. We should put all the red ones there and all the green ones there," which was slightly odd. And the secretary faithfully sort of moved them around. So it may be that he'd had some sort of, they think what the doctors at the time, and this would have been, I guess, 20 years ago, thought it could have been a stroke, a sort of milder stroke than the one that actually felled him in the fall of 1919. Very difficult to know, but he was someone who was prone to sudden attacks, which would really lay him low.
I think the general view now is that he did have two minor strokes while he was in Paris. And of course, he had one in 1905 when he was president of Princeton as well. So, another questions, please. Yeah, Barbara? There's a microphone, Barbara. Yeah. Why don't you just introduce yourself quickly?
Hi, I'm Barbara Perry, and I'm the co-chair of the Presidential Oral History Program here. And we talked a little bit about it last night at dinner, so this is one of those intriguing hypotheticals. Let us say we could resurrect Woodrow Wilson from his final resting place in the National Cathedral in Northwest Washington and bring him to the Miller Center, and we would have you and Mel on the panel to ask questions. What would be the first question you would ask him?
Oh. Do you want to go first?
I'd ask him, are you sorry you didn't compromise with the reservationists?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I think that would be the first question I would pose.
Yeah, and just on that, I mean, the interesting thing, this is not answering your question, but on the reservations that came attached to the treaty, the European leaders later said they could have worked with them. Whether or not they would have done is another matter, but Lloyd George, for example, said, if we'd had to, we would have accepted them because we wanted the United States in the League. I don't know. I might have liked to have pushed him on why he allowed more segregation rather than less in the federal service. I know he was a Southerner, but, this was a man who expressed high moral principles, was a great liberal. Why did he allow it? The federal post office, they began to segregate the offices, and this was happening elsewhere in Washington. And so I'd like to know what his rationale was for allowing that to happen.
I'd go even further than that, along the same lines. I think one would ask him, do you think you went too far in terms of your implementation of the Alien and Sedition laws that were passed at the time? Because one of the principal books that's been written about Wilson and World War I by a historian named Tom Knock makes the case that Wilson's actions undid Wilson's aspirations, and the principal ones was that he repressed his principal supporters along the progressive left
Yeah.
liberals, during 1918 and 1919, and very much alienated them and no longer could rely upon them for support afterwards. And they felt incredibly alienated by Wilson at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, please.
Thank you. Mary J. Abbott, retired Department of State USAID Foreign Service officer. Could you just very briefly compare and contrast, and this is going out,
Yep.
Yes, it's
very briefly compare and contrast the League of Nations and then the United Nations. What one has, the other one does or doesn't have, couple the articles perhaps, and how one developed from the other, if that was the case.
Yeah. Well, I think the UN certainly developed from the League of Nations. In fact, initially, the League still existed until 1945, and initially there was some talk of resurrecting the League and redoing it, and then they decided that it was so much identified with the outbreak of the Second World War that it wouldn't be worth doing. And so they decided to set up a new United Nations, but many of the League organizations, like the International Labour Organization, were carried over into the United Nations. So some of the associated bodies of the United Nations that we see, in fact, have a much longer history than the United Nations itself. And many of the personnel actually are carried over into the United Nations. I mean, I suppose the key difference with the United Nations is that the Security Council has 5 members permanent members with vetoes. And that was to reassure the great powers that their interests would always be listened to. Now, of course, the trouble now is that they reflect the wrong people. But I think that was one of the key differences. What happened with the League is that there would be, I think, was it 4 permanent members and 4 elected? There were meant to be 5 permanent members and 4 elected, but they'd all have equal votes. And then, of course, when the United States didn't join, you had fewer permanent members, and there was always the danger of deadlock. And I think Roosevelt was very concerned that the powers should be reassured that their voice would be heard in the United Nations, and which is why the Security Council still has so much power. I would say that's the key difference with the League. I think also, if you look at the United Nations, it was not as ambitious in what it has some of the same provisions, but it is, I think, more cautious in its approach to conflicts than the League of Nations was. And so therefore I think that the possibility of disappointment is less. But, in many ways I think the League was a useful, exercise is the wrong word, but it was a useful forerunner of the United Nations, and it introduced into our understanding and into the public the idea that we could actually have international organizations like this, which I think are useful. I think if we didn't have them, we'd be wanting to invent them. So that's a short answer to a complicated question.
one last question. Up here. Stephanie? Yeah.
John Watterson, do you think it really mattered that the United States did not join the League of Nations, especially considering the pacifism and anti-war sentiment that generally, and rejection of American participation in World War I that you see in the 1930s?
It's an interesting question. I mean, we'll never know. I think if the United States joined the League, it would have been a stronger institution, and it would have given a very important non-European voice to the League. I mean, as it was, the United States was so much involved in what was going on in Europe anyway, and it was a curious situation. I mean, when they tried to broker an end to the endless reparations question, twice the 2 agreements were done by Americans and backed by the United States. At disarmament conferences, League disarmament conferences, the United States was there. So the United States was often involved, and I think if they'd been more formally involved, it would have been good. I think it would have made the League stronger. And it might have served to educate American public opinion. If by the time the 30s hit, the United States was in the League, then I wonder if you would have had, I don't know, we'll never know, but would you have had the same isolationist sentiment? I mean, there was a lot of sentiment in Europe for peace. There was this huge peace ballad in Britain in the 1930s where I think half the adult population voted in favor of peace. But wanting peace doesn't necessarily translate into being isolationist. And it may be that in the United States, failure to join the League welded the peace movement in a way into isolationism, in a way that didn't happen in Europe. That you can want peace but still recognize that you have to be engaged in the world. So I don't know. It's very difficult. And you can argue, and I think historians are now arguing, that even in the 1930s, the United States was not as isolationist as we might think. And there's a lot of isolationist talk. But if you look at what the United States is actually doing, it's still involved a lot. And it's particularly involved, of course, on its own doorstep. The good neighbor policy is a 1930s policy. And the United States is still very much concerned about what's going on in the Pacific. So it's not as if the United States withdraws completely. But it's true that there was isolationist sentiment. And it was fueled, I think, by a sense that, and this is where historians came in, a lot of historians argued the United States should never have got involved in the war, that it was lured into it by Wilson or by unscrupulous Europeans. And so I think for a number of reasons, a lot of people sort of thought, we should never have got involved, we should never get involved again. But you can't always choose your fates, can you? So.
Well, that was a terrific last question and wonderful discussion here. We all want to thank you, Margaret, for coming and visiting us and for a really stimulating talk. Come again, please.
Thank you.
you.
Thank you so much. That's so kind of you. Thank you. Thank you.